the team that is in front of you. Joining us is Senator Kim Pate, and speaking first, and then Kim Beaudin, which is from the CAP, which is the Congress of Aboriginal People, and then Nicole Porter from Nicole Porter Associate would be third speaking. Afterwards, we will have questions from journalists. Okay, Senator Kim Pate, all yours.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And thank you to all of you for joining us on this day. I join you from the shores of the Kichisipi, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I have known Odelia and Nerissa Quewezance since they entered the prison system, the federal prison system, in 1994. And it was very clear very quickly that what had happened in their case constituted, in my humble opinion, a miscarriage of justice. It took some time for them to come to understand why many of us feel that way. And we're now in a situation where the Minister of Justice, thanks to the wonderful work of people like Chief Beaudin, people like APTN, who have done some incredible investigative reporting, investigative journalists writ large, as well as the work of Innocence Canada and James Lockyer and most importantly, in many respects, the incredible push that David Milgaard gave to this before his untimely passing. So today, our purpose is to say, not only should the federal government get on with the review, also should they ensure that we have the type of commission that was recommended by Mr. Justice Harry Laforme and Justice Juanita Westmoreland-Traore last year to review miscarriages of justice, recognizing that in the last couple of decades, the government has reviewed about 20 cases, all but one all of them were men, all but one was Indigenous and one was Indigenous and one was a Black man. Virtually no women's cases have been reviewed. We're heartened that the minister has agreed to basically have these cases reviewed, and that process is in place. In the meantime, however, given what is already available, given the existence of information that defenses weren't put forward, that in fact there are miscarriages of justice from policing right up through the system, we are calling today on the Minister of Justice for Saskatchewan, Justice Minister Eyre, to support the application of the sisters for review by the federal government, to support their application for bail pending a quashing, what we hope will be a quashing of their convictions, and to immediately stop their absurd request that in fact media not be permitted to report on this, and to attempt to keep all of this under wraps so that there is no accurate reporting of what has actually happened in this case. I think it's a travesty that council hasn't even had disclosure from the government at this stage. So the systemic racism we know continues as we're having this conversation. Indigenous women in the federal prison system are 50% of the prison population. In Saskatchewan, where these injustices occurred, they range from 75 to 95% of the population, as well as in Manitoba, the province next door, and the territories to the north. And when you look at Indigenous young women alone, which of course is the ages at which these both Odelia and Nerissa entered the system, the numbers are a horrific 98% of the youth jail population. So we're talking about a problem that is rife and requires immediate action, not just in Saskatchewan, but especially in Saskatchewan. So I look forward to any questions. We also have an opportunity with a bill that is before Parliament that a number of us will be working to try and improve, to try and also stem the tide of Indigenous, the mass incarceration of, in particular, Indigenous women, most of whom have, like Odelia and Nerissa, have histories of abuse, have histories of residential school involvement, have histories of child welfare involvement, and really their responses to violence first perpetrated against them is often what results in many Indigenous women being jailed for what are often referred to as violent offenses. Jailing more Indigenous women and relegating more of their kids to the care of the state is not going to make us safer. We need to act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kim Pate from CAP.
Oh, good morning, and thank you for facilitating this news conference. I'm coming to you from the homeland of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory, from Saskatoon. So I am in the province of Saskatchewan. When I heard that the Saskatchewan government was trying to muzzle the media, a lot of things went through my mind, and one of the things that I really believe is that they're trying to hide something, and I'm not sure what it is that they're trying to hide at this point. They did. This is a 31-year-old case, so meaning that I don't know if Canada's security is at risk. I mean, these are the kind of steps that a government would take addressing these kind of issues, and yet, to me, what's at risk here is the is releasing our Nerissa and Odelia. That's what's really at risk here. I mean, it's like they have a policy of till death do us part, and they want to keep both Nerissa and Odelia tied up in the justice system for the rest of their natural lives, and this has to end. This is nothing more than race-based policy, race-based justice. Indigenous people in this province and in Canada as well know that the systems are stacked against them. And Senator Pate put it right when in terms of the massive increases of Indigenous women in our federal penitentiaries and our provincial, as high as 85% in Saskatchewan, for example. When is it going to end? So yeah, I'm calling on the Saskatchewan government to step forward and do the right thing. They know it's the right thing, yet they continue with a policy that's over since 1905, since Saskatchewan became a province. So when is it going to end? That's the question I have, and I'm also deeply disturbed that they would want to silence the media. That's how the governments are held to account as well. So anyways, that's sort of where we stand as the Congress of Aboriginal people, and we will continue to fight for both Nerissa and Odelia, and we certainly will be at the courthouse next week on the 24th and 25th. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole Porter.
Thanks, Olivia. Today is really an opportunity to discuss some of the important developments that we've heard about the Quewezance case and reiterate the necessity in creating an independent criminal case review commission. But before I do get into details, I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge David Milgaard. He was a dear friend of mine. We worked tirelessly for the past few years advocating and trying to right the wrongs of our unjust system. It will be 6 months actually tomorrow since his passing. So it was fitting that our conference be held today. In the time that I knew David, he shared with me how painful it was to be in prison for something he didn't do. He suffered immensely during that time, yet as painful as it was, he'd never forget being a prisoner. In fact, he wanted to dedicate his life to helping other prisoners. And he could have understandably, once released, went out and never looked back. Nobody would have blamed him. Yet he still managed to come out and want to help other people. He wanted to advocate for prisoners, for the wrongfully convicted, and to make our unjust system just. That's one of the things that I admired about David. His work, he was passionate about what he did, and he turned his horrific experience into an opportunity to help others. I promised David to continue to work advocating for those who don't have a voice, to push for an independent criminal case review commission, and to try to right the wrongs in our criminal justice system. I know he's here today in spirit looking out for Odelia and Nerissa. David was the one who invited me to advocate for the Quewezance sisters. You know their story by now, 2 Indigenous women from the Quewezance First Nation in Saskatchewan who were wrongfully convicted of murder and who have spent 30 years in prison when the person who confessed to the crime served his time and was released 25 years ago. As you know, James Lockyer filed an application for ministerial review in December of 2021. We hosted a press conference at Parliament Hill in June, and that same day, our Federal Justice Minister, David Lametti, acknowledged formally that a miscarriage of justice could have likely occurred in this case, thereby starting a review into the matter. Subsequently, Odelia and Nerissa have bail hearings coming up on November 24th and 25th in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. It's bad enough that these Indigenous women have spent this long in prison for a crime they didn't commit. I can attest to myself, having looked at the original trial transcripts indicating a lack of evidence. And there was a confession at the time of the trial and on national television years later. But now the Quewezance sisters have new parole conditions, as most of you know by now, at their most recent parole review, and it restricts them from speaking to the media. In addition, certain members of the Saskatchewan government have made it very clear that they would rather see these women locked up indefinitely than ever be released. We are seeking a remedy for these Indigenous women, yet at every corner we face resistance from the very government that falsely put them away in the first place. And to make matters even worse, as of last week, the senior Crown attorney filed an application to the Court of King's Bench in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, for a discretionary publication ban on their upcoming bail hearing. She's also asking to seal court records. As you can appreciate, having that openness is absolutely necessary to maintain independence and, of course, ensure the impartiality of our court system. As others have said, no good happens when the Crown wants proceedings kept from the public, and it begs the question, what are they trying to hide? This case is now one of public interest. Thousands upon thousands of Canadians want justice for Odelia and Nerissa, and as Canadians, we will not stand for this. The Saskatchewan government should be acknowledging the harm done to these Indigenous women and attempting to rectify this miscarriage of justice. They should not be trying to hinder their release by filing unnecessary publication bans, as we've said, by attempting to seal records that should be public knowledge, and by opposing their release after they've spent a gross amount of time in prison for a crime they did not commit. Canada has lost so many Indigenous people to government policies, to abuse, to murder, to injustice. And this really is an opportunity to fix one of those mistakes. It's a part of reconciliation. Our country needs to do better going forward, but that also means looking back and correcting some of the mistakes that have been made. Not everything, mind you, can be fixed, but allowing Odelia and Nerissa to go home is certainly a step in the right direction. I've recently sent 1,002 pages, yes, pages, to members of the Saskatchewan government outlining the signatures obtained thus far in the petition that we've created, almost 50,000 concerned Canadian citizens. I want them to know that we are not going to stand for this and watch these Indigenous women languish away, spending more time in prison for a crime that someone else confessed to, served their sentence for, and was released over 2 decades ago. Odelia and Nerissa couldn't be with us today, obviously, but I speak with Odelia every few days. She continues to tell me how badly they want to go home. She's told me that they long for a normal life, surrounded by their family. She does have empathy. She said this before for what did happen to Mr. Dolph, but she maintains her innocence to this day. She's grateful for the public support and that, of course, the Justice Minister has acknowledged that a miscarriage of justice could have likely occurred. And she prays to the Creator that justice will happen and that she and Nerissa will be finally set free after all of this time. So as we've said before, we are calling on the Saskatchewan Minister of Justice to support Odelia and Nerissa in their application to the federal government to squash their convictions, to agree to their release on bail pending the decision, and to immediately stop this absurd attempt to muzzle the press, and of course to finally stop the serious systemic racism toward Indigenous people. The contact information, if it hasn't already, will be posted in the chat. So we all urge you to call the minister's office and write her. This is an unfortunate example, just one unfortunate example of how critical it is that our government create an independent criminal case review commission. The current process has sent only about 20 referrals back to the courts, which works out to be 1 a year, where other commissions around the world refer back hundreds, if not more. There are potentially thousands of wrongful convictions. So what I do know, and that what many of us have already acknowledged, is that whatever this new commission looks like, we have to do much better than what we're doing now. And this also means that we need to tackle some of these systemic issues that Kim Pate and that Kim Beaudin have said before me. As an Indigenous woman myself who has worked within the criminal justice system, I am cognizant of some of those challenges that we're talking about, of certain barriers and of the blatant systemic racism and bias that does exist. So I do sincerely hope that a new commission will address some of these issues. And I hope that overall we can change the way our justice system addresses individuals who are entering it. We are hopeful that the government will actually make an announcement by the end of this year, which would be a step, obviously, in the right direction in terms of seeing it become a reality. The Quewezance case is just one example of the absolute need for a commission of this nature. We can't sit back and wait. It should be in place already. It needs to happen right now. And because, as David would say, justice delayed is justice denied. Thank you.
Well said, Nicole. Now to my media friends, feel free to open up your mic. If you could either raise your hand or you could put in chat your interest in asking questions. And Dwayne Peterson from CBC, I believe, if you could open up your mic.
Hi, Olivia. Hi, thanks for taking the question. I heard you, Nicole, talking about the Independent Criminal Case Commission. I was wondering if someone might be able to discuss that a bit more and its kind of role in this case.
Who wants to take it? Kim, Senator?
Sure, I can start. So during the process of the review that Justices Laforme and Juanita Westmoreland-Traore did, they asked me to convene a group of Indigenous women who I was concerned and who we had been advocating had experienced miscarriages of justice. And so through that process, they met with Odelia and Nerissa, and through that as a result of that, they encouraged us to produce the report that some of you will be familiar with around the injustices and miscarriages of justice in the cases of 12 Indigenous women. These are 12 women I have known for decades. They are not the only women, Indigenous women, who've experienced miscarriages of justice, but that was part of how the process started. And as you will likely be aware, both justices recommended a new process that would be much more responsive to addressing the systemic barriers to both to justice in the first instance and then to reviewing miscarriages of justice. And that's a process we're waiting still for the response of the government. The Minister of Justice commissioned the review, and so we're waiting for a response to that. In the meantime, this process of re-examining in the individual cases of both Nerissa and Odelia has been commenced by the Minister of Justice, and for that we are very happy, but we also need to see the more broad-based review process commenced as well.
Anyone else, Nicole or Kim?
I can say just something very briefly. Kim, you've covered most of it. I was in touch with one of the senior advisors, and they have recently been in touch with the Justice Minister, David Lametti. We are hopeful, which is why I had mentioned that earlier, that we will see something come down the line either by Christmas or by the new year. I know that's hopeful, but that's sort of the word that we've gotten back right now. We need to be able to see what's being proposed, to see how the commission will look like, and go from there. But certainly it's a step in the right direction. And I mean, it's better than what we would have now. And the process that we have now, as Kim has said, is very potentially lengthy. And there are way too many cases put forth on the table for them to ever be reviewed without a commission of this nature.
Okay, thank you. I see another hand, Shirley Lee from City News National.
Hi, thank you for holding this event and for taking my question. I just want to get a clearer understanding of provincial and federal roles here, because I understand the bail hearing is in a provincial court. You've mentioned some of the advocacy and appeals towards the federal justice minister. I just want to get some sort of clarity or a bit more context on what role the federal government can play going forward in this instance.
Senator Pate? You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, you think I'd have this mute and unmute function down by now, but so the federal government at this stage the minister has decided that they will conduct a review. It is within the purview of the minister to actually decide to quash the convictions, to end the process right now. The likelihood of that happening without them engaging in a more fulsome review of what has happened in this case is obviously not occurring yet, but that is within the purview. Within the provincial government, the provincial government has the authority to determine what evidence is being provided. To the best of my knowledge, they have not even produced disclosure yet. So they haven't released the documents to Mr. Lockyer, the lawyer for Odelia and Nerissa Quewezance, to enable him to know even what the case is. And it's not, there's a team of lawyers, but headed by Mr. Lockyer. So they don't even know what actually is not being provided. Then add to that, the provincial government is trying to seek a publication ban. That tells us that there is something, when it smells, when it, it looks like there's a problem, as has already been said by others, chances are there is something significantly wrong with how this case was handled. And I would say, just on the basis of what I know, from the time of the investigation through to charges being laid, through to the conviction, and certainly the appeal process, there seems to be problems at virtually every stage of this proceeding. And that is not surprising. That's exactly the sort of thing we found with not just these two women, but the 12 women whose cases we've reviewed. And so, again, back to the federal jurisdiction, the federal government could conduct a review of starting with these 12 women who we've identified and say, look at what systemically it shows as a problem. Most of the women are from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. One is from, or two are from Atlantic, all Indigenous women. And then the other piece that the province could do is decide to urge the federal government and join the federal government in wanting to do a review, presumably so they can correct the miscarriages of justice. It seems to me that the attempt to, instead of continuing to deny responsibility, deflect attention away by not having you or the public have access to what actually happened, allows them to continue to keep their heads in the sand and presumably continue this trajectory of more and more people into the criminal legal system. I don't call it a justice system because right now there's not much just about it, particularly for Indigenous women who are the fastest growing prison population in this country. And yet most of us would say, as I said earlier, that is not who we think of when we think of who poses a risk to public safety. And a response that encourages the continuation of disproportionately jailing Indigenous mothers, relegating their kids to state care, is not making us safer. And it's certainly not addressing the systemic biases that exist within the system, both in terms of race, class, and gender.
Wow. Thank you.
I wanted to add one other thing as well. Given that I've lived in the province of Saskatchewan for many years, 35 years now, and seen in terms of how the justice system works here and how they apply their policies in that provincially to Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, I was very, on one hand, I was saddened by the reaction of this Saskatchewan party, the Saskatchewan government. And on the other hand, I realized that that's sort of, they've earned the nickname, unfortunately, this province earned the nickname of Alabama of the North. And that's a nickname that we should not have. But when it comes to a class in terms of with respect to the justice system and how it applies to Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, it's just not working. And they should really take a long look in the mirror. One thing too that I know, Saskatchewan government has been non-compliant in any requests that we've made towards them, information that we wanted, anything like that. It's all come out. It's like you're hiding something, and yet they turn around and claim that they have a justice system that treats people fairly, applies the rule of the law. None of that's true, really, when you look at this. And so, yeah, there should be accountability as well to the minister and all the people who made these decisions within the justice system itself here in Saskatchewan. I'd sure like to see some accountability. So anyways, that's kind of my perspective where I'm coming from, and hopefully things will change, but I'm really not holding my breath on that one. So thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the media? If the media folks want the recording, please put your contact information in chat so we could email you the this recording. Also for others, this is a public document, so do email us. Put your email on chat, and we will send this recording to you. Dwayne, you have another question.
Yeah, I just want to follow up. At the beginning, Senator Pate, you mentioned that when you first saw this case back in the 1990s, you noticed then that it seemed like it could be a miscarriage of justice. I'm just kind of curious, like, is that something that you started looking into back then? And did you hit a lot of barriers to this point, or I guess what was kind of the time difference between then and now, for you at least?
That's a very good question. For part of the reason I pulled the document together is when they met with the justices, Justice Westmoreland Traore and Harry Laforme, the women were still reluctant to even have their names be identified, because the extent to which they have experienced injustices is rife, right from when they were children in residential schools, many of them. Some of them are first generation, but a number of them are actual residential school survivors themselves. And so part of the challenge was even ensuring they understood the extent to which the system had failed them, so unused to a system being responsive to their needs. So whether it was the residential school system where the abuse happened, and even if they reported it, it wasn't believed, whether it was in their home situation or their communities where they reported abuse and nothing was done, or the state authorities were part of that abuse, whether it was in the child welfare system, and then some of them were in the juvenile system as well, or the investigations, as in this situation for Odelia and Nerissa, where it was very clear that there was all kinds of context about what had happened with them, how they had responded that night to the sexual and other advances of the men who died. And the fact that all of that was not even contextualized is part of what I mean by that. And so if you are an Indigenous woman in this country, I think the best way to describe it is the very same issues that have given rise to Indigenous women being the fastest growing prison population are the same issues that the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls revealed give rise to them being more likely to be disappeared, murdered, homeless, and on the streets. And it's very much the same issues. And the biases that exist throughout not just the criminal legal system, but the child welfare system, the education system, society writ large, have been at play. And so many of the women themselves initially did not even see how they were treated as different from how they had always been treated. And so for some of them, including Odelia and Nerissa, it took some time before they recognized that what had happened to them I would just not say one miscarriage, but miscarriages of justice, period. And so that's part of the challenge, not just for these women, but for all of the others that we've chronicled in the report, and for too many others in the system. And it also applies often to young people and to men. But we see the most egregious situation in terms of the incarceration rates when we focus on where the intersections of those discriminations meet, and that is young Indigenous women who are poor, who've experienced the trauma of past abuse, residential school, and child welfare survival, and that's who we see most commonly overrepresented. And we're not investing in communities, despite lots of great language and talk about it. We're not actually implementing the TRC calls to action or the MMIWG calls for justice. And what happened to so many folks in this country, Indigenous people, this it screams out, and in many ways, Odelia and Nerissa's case is emblematic of that, and why we have to fundamentally change what we're doing, invest in communities, and in addition to trying to remedy the wrongs of the past, trying to prevent future similar situations, because they're ongoing. It's still happening. We know from even the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Sharma on Friday, not to take us off track, but there's another example of more than half of the Supreme Court, or the court that looked at that case, saying there was not a link between mass incarceration of Indigenous women and their inequities. You'd have to be living with your head in the sand to not get that by now in this country.
Thanks, Senator Pate. And just a really quick follow-up to, you'd mentioned before some statistics about the amount of Indigenous women in prisons in Saskatchewan. I was wondering where you were citing those from, or if that's something that you've gathered, as part of some of these standing committees.
No, that's a great question. The first stat in terms of 50% comes from the Office of the Correctional Investigator. They released that earlier this year. The 75 to 100% or 95% comes from provincial bodies, and some of the work that also has been being followed up through the TRC and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The 98% actually came from our own research when I had been asked to testify in the sentencing of a young Indigenous woman in Saskatchewan. And I wanted to have a look at I knew the incarceration rates were high for adult Indigenous women, for anybody over the age of 18. I had no idea they were as horrific as they were. So that stat is a couple of years old. But when I've spoken to folks at the Department of Justice, they are the ones who have then said, well, Saskatchewan and Manitoba are usually vying for first place. And the last time I checked Manitoba, it was 95% to 100%, depending on the day. And the North, similarly, those stats. But so that's where they come from. And horribly, they may be even higher now. Chief Beaudin mentioned 85% in Saskatchewan. I don't doubt that. Most recently, the last time I was in one of the provincial jails in Saskatchewan, you were hard pressed to find and see a non-Indigenous person. And then the stats actually get, sorry if I can just continue on that, the stats get worse. The correctional investigator, a week before last, released a report showing that 64% of those who are classified as maximum security within the federal prison population are Indigenous when we look at women alone. And the Ministerial Advisory Committee, looking at the use of segregation, the structured intervention units as they're now called, said that 76% of the women who get segregated in what is essentially the replacement for solitary confinement in this country are Indigenous. So you see the trajectory of the injustices and the systemic biases continuing throughout the system. And that's also a theme in the situation for Odelia and Nerissa. They were classified as high security right from the beginning. And that has continued through in terms of limiting their access to programs and services and conditional release, and then resulting in the types of conditions that, although they're on parole in the community, they can be re-jailed for things that if they were not subject to parole, they likely wouldn't be jailed for. Things like missing curfew because you're concerned about your kid, sometimes slipping in your addiction and using alcohol or drugs, but there's kinds of things that if there wasn't the threat of another up to 5 years in prison without parole eligibility, which can be one of the consequences, then we might not, we likely wouldn't see them back in the system. And so It's a function of the way the system has been set up that disproportionately will continue to keep impacting them in these negative ways.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Just last thing, all the guests that are attending, if you want to be in a photo, I'm going to capture the screen so that we can maybe send a photo to the two sisters that may give them a sense that they are not alone. So those of you that can turn on your camera, that would be fabulous. And Dawn, Jessica, thank you. I'm going to do a screen capture right now. Yep. Oh, you just moved one more time. Thank you. I see that there is no other question, and I want to thank everybody for attending. Those of you that want to, Nigel, you just came. Let me just do one more photo. Those of you that want a copy of the recording, please put your email address on the chat. We'll save the chat and we will send you the recording in probably less than half an hour, because it takes a few minutes to for it to capture. So I just want to again thank you to all all of you folks for attending, and we will keep you informed as to what's happening. Thank you again for